you. Thank you very much, John, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, award winners. Let me just briefly say how important it was to me to win the Fisher International Memorial Award almost 10 years ago for the book In Defense of Global Capitalism. Because before that, I used to be a lonely, young, bizarre, eccentric with radical ideas. Afterwards, I was a lonely, bizarre, eccentric with radical ideas and a prize. And that's important. And that's actually, and especially in a small country like Sweden, where we really care a lot about what other people think of us in other places. It gave me a lot of legitimacy in the Swedish debate, because suddenly people thought that, someone else, somewhere else, cares about what this chap thinks. So maybe there is something to it. So I'm deeply honored and happy about that prize. Tonight I've been asked to share a couple of thoughts on how we win new generations and their hearts and minds for the ideas of freedom. And to do that, I need to give you some sort of context, the context in which we are trying to win these hearts and minds. So I thought, why don't I tell you what I think has happened since I wrote this book 10 years ago? What has happened since In Defense of Global Capitalism and the award that it was given? Well, first of all, in my private life, we can see a lot of things have changed. I cut my hair, for one thing. You can't believe how many people have told me this last day that they don't recognize me anymore. There's something strange about me. And yes, I got a haircut, but only last week, actually. And but speaking of that, I must inform you about the most important part of my speech. And that's a quote from a speech that Hillary Clinton gave when she was newly elected senator in 2001 to Yale University graduating class of 2001. She said, "The most important thing that I have to say today is that hair matters." This is a life lesson that my family did not teach me, that Yale did not instill in me. The importance of hair. Your hair will tell people who you are and what you stand for, what hopes and dreams you have for the world. Likewise, your shoes, but mostly the hair. So, to sum up my speech here today, pay attention to your hair. End of quote. But to all of those who have expressed disappointment in my new hairstyle, I must also tell you that I believe in growth. I believe that after a dismal second quarter and third quarter, I think we will be coming back to some sort of new balance. There's some sort of creative destruction going on right now, but we'll find our way back in the end. And of course, then John Maynard Keynes would say, in the long run, we're all bald. But I think that he's wrong there as well. But we'll see about that. Anyway, over these last 10 years, I got married, I got 2 kids, I've become a bit older, a bit wiser, hopefully, more experienced. And as Will Rogers put it, good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. I've read more, I've seen more, I've met more people, I've traveled to places I only pretended to have visited at that time of my life. So far my personal life, but worldwide, what has happened to all those hopes, those dreams, those ambitions that we had 10 years ago? And well, let me say that the record is mixed. The record is truly mixed. In some ways, the world have become much better than I could have imagined. But in other words, it's much worse than I could have imagined. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. It was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair. Let me begin with some hope, and then I'll move on to the despair later on. In some ways, the world is a much, much better place. Technological progress, scientific progress has kept on going. The promise of inventions, innovations, nanotechnology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, they keep surprising us all the time. When it comes to the economy, despite two bubbles and a great recession worldwide, about 20% of all the wealth that has ever been created in the world has been created during these 10 years. And we see the result of that in poverty reduction all over the world. Extreme poverty over these 10 years, despite the financial crisis, has been amazing. More than 500 million people have left extreme poverty. More than 500 million fewer people are extremely poor today than 10 years ago, despite the growth of populations. That means 5 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty every year, 140,000 people every day, because of scientific, technological, and economic progress. So, in other words, all those policies that were in place, liberalization, globalization, free market institutions, have created wonders over these last 10 years. The problem is that we have not seen the same progress when it comes to politics. Quite the contrary, we've seen in many ways a backlash against those ideas during these 10 years. I think that it's fair to say that in China, over these last 10 years, we've seen the return of the state in the economy. In Russia, we've seen the return of the Tsar. In Latin America, we've seen the return of the strong man in many ways. Around the world, we've seen a return of state capitalism, state-owned companies that begin to buy the private ones. We've seen a return of the ideas of governments picking winners in the economy, as it's called. It's really a euphemism for picking losers, but you get the idea. Liberalization around the world has stalled, especially when it comes to trade and movement across borders. The World Trade Organization has done nothing really to promote free trade over these last 10 years. In the European Union, we've seen bloated welfare state that can't even pay their own bills. As Margaret Thatcher put it, the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you'll run out of other people's money. Well, now we're running out of our children's money and our grandchildren's money. The promise of the free lunch that seemed so tempting at the time has turned into an ever more expensive check and an incredible shrinking lunch. As for the United States, do you remember the era when the era of big government was over? That was only in 1996, and that was what Bill Clinton said. At that time, federal spending was around 20% of GDP. Today, it's 26% of GDP. And if you include state and local level, it's 40% of GDP. I mean, larger than the Canadian government, right? That's a bit of an ironic twist in the history of events. The United States got a president, George W. Bush, who said that when someone hurts, the government has to move. And we've had our fair share of hurting over these last 10 years. We've had terrorism, we've had wars, we've had global warming and environmental destruction, and we've had the financial crisis. And as we all know, war is the health of the state. But I think we can expand on that old saying and say that crisis generally is the friend of the state. Because when people are hurting, when things fall apart, they look to the centralized government, to the strong leader to deal with those things. And therefore we got the return of the government in surveillance, in a lot of different measures to try to watch over people, the takeover of healthcare, stimulus packages, bailouts of private industries, exactly all those things that we fought against. Well, with some exceptions, like Tom Palmer's private bailout of the airline industry, when it goes back and forth all over the world to promote classical liberalism. But I find that acceptable, but all the rest of these ideas have been quite miserable. And it's so depressing because it's déjà vu all over again. It's a tragedy because we thought we had won all those debates on picking winners, on bailouts, and suddenly we had the return of the welfare warfare watchman state. So politically, as it has been said popularly in the media, the Reagan revolution really is over. This 25-year-old momentum for liberalization is really over in a way. Our momentum has stalled. We've lost this round. And at the same time, the results of the reforms of that era keeps impressing on us. So it's really a mixed record. Reality is on our side, much more than it has been for a very long time. But politics is definitely not on our side. And in any clash between the reality and our politicians, I'm afraid reality loses out in the long run unless we do something about it. At the same time, I don't want to depress you, because it's not really strange. We shouldn't be surprised that old battles that we thought that we had already won are suddenly being reopened. That's the nature of this business. That's the nature of mankind's experience. Because trying to put forth ideas, debating, advocating, is not like Star Wars. It's not like, the Star Wars saga when we can look forward to the last episode when the Death Star is blown to pieces and we can live happily ever after. And we need prequels to sort of recreate the drama and the tension. That's not the way it works. That's not the way history works. It's more like Star Trek than Star Wars. It's more like on a weekly basis, we have new adventures, new risks, new threats, new life and new civilizations with new ideas for bailouts and stimulus packages that we have to fight constantly and to go boldly where no one has gone before. Because this is what happens when society changes. When, as we grow richer, we begin to take wealth for granted. And then we see the demand for redistribution. Then we see that the strongest force in the universe, again, is the temptation to get something for nothing. We see the interest groups in politics, in bureaucracies, in businesses who constantly try to fight for their own privileges and their own resources and their own powers. We can see in a period of rapid change of globalization that we always see this hunt for space goats and scapegoats and all those things. Someone to blame for all this misery. Foreigners, foreign competition, creative destruction, and it doesn't really seem very creative when it happens to yourself. Of course, we can see the benefits as well. We can do research about it. We can see that free trade is not just destructive in the short run. In the long run, it creates enormous results. One calculation has it that the American population has gained something like $1 trillion because of the free trade reforms being done since the Second World War. But we've never seen those resources. We've never received that check that said, this is because of free trade. Congratulations, here you go, $1 trillion. No, instead we can see it in our everyday actions, purchases in stores, in our bookshelves, in our refrigerators and all those things. And then you don't think of it as the result of a specific policy. So with all these things against us, the constant threats that keeps coming back, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And that is what we're doing. And let's not be depressed about it, but because that's the nature of the game. And meanwhile, if we can keep on running, we produce marvelous results. So, in the light of this context, of these last 10 years, what do we do about it? How do we proceed from here? How do we try to, again, win the momentum back? Well, obviously, we have to try to fight even harder to reach out to people, and especially to reach out to the young. Get them when they're young. And I don't know about you, but I, for one, has not had a radical idea that really changed my worldview for quite some time. So that's why I had to sort of get new hair styles and things like that to seem like a dynamic guy. Because there's something different about being young. You have less to lose in the world. You don't have a fixed mindset. You don't really know what kind of special interest group you're going to belong to later on. So you're still open to new radical ideas. And the brain scientists, they tell us that the prefrontal cortex is not really developed until you're 25 or something like that. And especially those parts that deal with controlling your impulses and thinking long term, they're not really developed until we're 25. And that's a good thing. That's really important because as a teenager, historically, just think of it, you have to move out into a world filled with strangers, you know nothing about them, and yet you're trying to meet them, find companions, trying to develop your own identity, perhaps find someone to share the rest of your life. And that's scary. That's incredibly scary. So you probably need to be a bit not too risk averse and not being able to control your impulses when you do that. For evolutionary reasons, it's a good thing. As a psychology professor puts it, teenagers have highly efficient accelerators, but only partly developed brakes. So unfortunately, or perhaps it's a good thing, we will never again be as open and have as much imagination and be as open to new ideas as we were when we were young, except possibly if we have midlife crisis. But young people generally believe in change. And unfortunately, it means that they also believe in change you can believe in. This is, it's the very same mindset, it's the very same worldview that brought us the New Deal, the Great Society, Obamacare, and for that matter, fascism, nationalism, and communism. But it's also the mindset that brought us abolitionism. It brought us the free trade and peace movement in Europe in the 19th century. It brought us the Reagan Revolution. It brought us the fight against dictators in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and other places. So it's a worldview that can be developed in different ways. And that's why it's so important to really reach out to it. Another reason to reach out to the young is, of course, that the young will soon be old and govern the world. They will rule the world, and I'm still shocked at the speed with which people that I grew up with suddenly took power in Sweden and began to implement a lot of those ideas that we had in the sort of young liberal movement in Sweden. And my friend Håkan Tribell from Timbro talked about that earlier today. Suddenly Sweden had school vouchers, partly privatized social security system, abolishing a lot of wealth and death taxes, reducing taxation actually from around 58% of GDP to around 43% today. That's really quite impressive. Something happened with Carl Bildt and all those others along the road. They picked up some ideas that they were trying to spread to others. And even later generations. So what do we do? How do we reach out again? Can we be better at doing what we're doing? Should we try even harder, argue even harder, and become more intense in our struggle? I don't think so. And let me share some personal background here. I used to think that the most consistent person wins. If I met someone who said that I agree with you 90% of what you're saying, I usually spent all my time discussing the 10% where we didn't agree and attacking them for sort of betraying the principles that they should believe in. I was sort of constantly on the hunt for inconsistencies and betrayals. I was the Spanish Inquisition in everything except the soft cushions and the comfy chair. Until one day I realized that this whole thing, arguing in that way, only made them defensive. It only forced them to dig their heels in and fight back as hard as they can. Because people don't want to lose face, and they don't want to lose their principles. They have some devotion to that and some loyalty to their principles, and that's something we should cherish, because that's really a good thing. So, and especially if they suffer for their principles, they really grow attached to it. That's another thing that psychology teaches us. If we have an experiment, you want to join a student organization, sign the dotted line, or you join a student association and you go through some sort of painful trials. the result is always that when they're asked to rate the organization that they just joined, they love the one that put them to a lot of painful things, because it's sort of, well, probably evolutionary. We think that this means that it's something important because we've fought over this. We fought for it. And some psychologists think that that's why we love our children. I would never say such a thing on record. But furthermore, if you fight people like that, if you just offer them blood and tears for their principles, they don't like you. And you are not the kind of person that they think that they need to be respected by. As Dave Barry once put it, I argue very well. Ask any of my remaining friends. I can win an argument on any topic against any opponent. People know this and steer clear of me at parties. Often, as a sign of their great respect, they don't even invite me. And I think there's something to be learned from that experience. You know, this old bestseller by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, has it in principle 1 from the section How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking, that the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. And by that he meant that you're not really trying to win an argument, you're trying to win converts to your cause. You're not trying to win a debate, you're trying to win hearts and minds of people. And in that case, it's not a good thing to look for heathens. You should look for converts. You should find the common ground, the 90%, and try to expand on that. And I suddenly, for one, realized that people were more open to my ideas when I didn't try to shove it down their throats in that way. So nowadays, I don't argue. I never argue, except when there's an audience there. And I try to win the audience rather than the person I'm arguing with. Or when it's someone I really dislike. Or when it's the woman I love. Because then you just have to. So what do we do when we're not arguing? When we're not debating, but rather trying to find the common ground? I think that what we're doing is trying to explain the world in a way that resonates with people and resonates with their experiences, to get them to understand that we know what their problems are and that our principles somehow explain this and can deal with it better. Dale Carnegie also puts it somewhere in the book that my favorite food is strawberries and cream, and yet when I go fishing, I never have strawberries on the hook. Because that's not what the fish like. Instead, I attract fish by putting worms on the hook. Because the fish is more important than I am in that situation. And this might sound a bit condescending and patronizing when we're talking about winning the hearts and minds of young people. But it's an illustration of a basic and important fact, that if we want our ideas to go forth and multiply in the world, then it's not about us. It's really about them. It's not about the speakers, it's about the listeners. We have to recognize the wealth and diversity of human experience, and that we don't all have the same background, the same kind of situation, that we face different problems. And we have to be better at showing that our ideas can explain these different situations and offer solutions. That we see how someone who is in a different situation is deprived of his dignity if he's forced to pay a bribe when he's trying to go about his daily business. What it is like to be young and have your whole life ahead of you, and yet not being able to find a job. To have beliefs or a sexual orientation that the majority is not willing to accept. To see that our ideas is not sort of our kind of strawberry and cream, that we understand the diversity of life. And that's one of the reasons why I really like the work that Atlas is doing, especially in this international setting. Not trying to explain that we know the right way and it's our way or the highway, but rather looking at the different traditions, different situations, and trying to appeal to people in different ways. we have to translate the ideas of freedom into local languages in order to prove that freedom is a universal language. Our goal should be to make sure that as many as possible meet our ideas and deepen their understanding during their formative years, while they're still open to new ideas and new principles that can explain their part of life. Obviously, we can't reach everybody, and that has never been the ambition. But if we can do it to those most curious, those who are most able and eager to understand the world and explain it to others, then we can make progress. If we can move and shake the movers and shakers. Because they are looking for answers. They are curious. Because if you don't have the principles, it seems like there's so many mysteries out there, so many strange things that are crying out for an explanation. It's a mystery why the government doesn't work, despite all the ambitions, despite all the hope and change and all those things. Why is it that we build welfare states to deal with the worst misery that we can see? And yet 40% of GDP in public spending later, we are still discussing how to deal with the worst misery. Why is it that at the same time that the government explains that meat and bread are human rights and shouldn't be commodities on a market, meat and bread disappear from the shelves, and instead we have meat and bread lines? Why is it that the wealthiest countries in the world are so heavily indebted? Why is it that California spends something like 25% more on public services today than 10 years ago, and yet few people think that they're 25% better? Why is it that Britain spends almost twice as much on public health care and schools today than it did 10 years ago? And yet, if you speak to Britons, most of them think that the quality has gone down. Why does it always happen again when the politicians just told us that they had to regulate so that it never happens again? Why is it that politicians talk about how the welfare state promotes solidarity and harmony, and yet it turns into a civil war between pressure groups who try to point out that they deserve and that the others don't, often into the ugliest wars between different groups, and often into pure anti-immigrant and racist feelings, racism which Ayn Rand famously called the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. This all seems like bizarre paradoxes, but are easily solved if you understand the logic of voluntary action and the nature of government. Just like a magician's tricks seem obvious when you know how they do it. We are at an important point of time. With a kind of overreach of government, we see more problems like this. And paradoxically, that's a great opportunity, perhaps a one-in-a-generation opportunity, to nail those problems down one by one and explain what they're all about, why they're there, and what kind of principles can deal with them. We can do this so that we can change our ways and expand freedom for the long term. And we've already seen a reaction against this government overreach, against the public debts. In the USA, the reactions and the Tea Party movements and other things, but also in Europe and in many other parts of the world. But it's also more important than ever that these things really work. Because if we don't succeed, the risk is that the bad consequences of one intervention creates a demand for correcting interventions, and that we accelerate this whole process until we destroy the foundations and the institutions that create all these amazing developments that have taken place over the last 10 years. We can do it. We have more research on our side than ever, more embedded think tanks than ever, which has been proven here today. We have more people on our side than ever, and they're better informed and better communicators than ever, and our ideas are more available than ever. John Goodman said that at lunch today, being sort of a non-socialist when he was young at campus made you a very lonely guy. And I remember sort of the thrill of going to the library in school and finding a book about classical liberalism. Granted, it was written by an opponent explaining that these are bizarre and evil ideas. But the very fact that someone wrote about these ideas, I didn't have to invent everything by myself. There were actually someone there. That sort of puts some perspective on on the rise of the internet and our ways of making ideas available and how important that is. We can really do it. We can. But if we really want to win the hearts and minds of the young, we need one more thing. If we want someone to devote his life to a cause and to alienate the campus friends, perhaps the teachers, perhaps parents, siblings, we can't just offer the goal of a GDP per capita that has been increased by a fraction. We can't just offer a bit more efficiency in government. We can't just offer something that is a bit sort of less costly, a bit worse, but at least it's cheaper. That's not the kind of ideas that capture the imagination of almost anyone, and especially not the young. And it's not enough to show that the other ideas are misguided and that they would not accomplish what they were hoping for. Personally, I used to abhor and really hate what I called neoliberalism, free market neoliberalism, because I thought it was about protecting the status quo. I thought it was about protecting the kind of power relations that I saw around me when I was growing up. And when economists just shrugged and said, almost with malice, when someone said, shouldn't the government be doing this to help people, saying that, sorry, it won't work, and it's just not doable. You have to accept the way things are. It seemed to me like a way of saying, sorry, this planet is very old. We've seen everything, we've tried everything, and nothing really works, so you have to be satisfied with what we have to offer. And when you grow up, you'll really understand why. And that is a mistake. That's a big and possibly lethal mistake. Classical liberalism, or libertarianism, is a radical philosophy that challenges the powerful and the vested interests. We are not in favor of the status quo. We are the ones who challenge the politicians, the labor unions, the corporations when they're looking for corporate welfare, protection, and tariffs and privileges. All those who want privileges and want to tell us how to lead our lives. Capitalism is the first system in history that is not based on the exploitation of others. It's not based on forced labor. It's based on the ideas that you become better off only if you make others better off. It's the idea that businesses can only stay in business if they create value to others, to customers, to employees, to investors, to society. Sure, we offer one big no to coercion, to the government intervention that we can see all around us. But that's because we say yes to a multitude, to an infinity of peaceful alternatives, because we believe in innovation and progress, because we still think that the world is young, and that the best ideas have not been thought out, and that the best solutions have not been tried yet. And that is another reason for me to be thinking that we have to emphasize not just the efficiency of capitalism, but the morality of capitalism. That it's just, that it's fair, that it is right. And that's another reason for me to be grateful to the work of Atlas. You've been doing this for quite some time, and I understand that Tom Palmer has just edited an anthology on the morality of capitalism to be spread on campuses, commissioned in something like 60,000 copies and to be spread around the world in many different languages, and probably help to bail out the airline industry again. That is important. The morality of capitalism. This is what we have to deal with as well, apart from the other things. But this is really important because, you know, I have a friend who actually printed a T-shirt that said, Pareto optimality. That was his sort of rallying cry. And I respect him for it. But it's not a coincidence that he didn't have many followers. In doing this, it didn't really take off like the Che Guevara T-shirt. Because no revolution was ever conducted in the name of a bit more efficiency. It does not capture the imagination of people. It does not capture the imagination of the young. So you have to become better at explaining this, the morality on our side. That it's not just more efficient, it is moral. I know that the profit and the market system makes some business people feel guilty. And even some advocates of the system feel guilty about this whole thing. And what kind of a way is that of going through life? To make the world better for others and being ashamed of it. No, we really need to hold our heads up high and feel pride, because free markets really is the moral system. So thank you. Thank you not just for dinner, not just for the time up here on the stage, but thank you for all the hard work and the energy and the resources that you devote for that which is moral, fair, good, and right. Thank you very much.